So welcome to Module 5, and today we're going to be talking about scheduling and timelines. So just as a bridge from what we covered in our last module, last session we talked about turning projects into deliverables, and that was our work breakdown structure and turning work into work packages. And today we're going to focus on how we sequence that work. And we're going to talk about dependencies and keeping our timelines on time. So some of the key concepts we're going to talk about today are task sequencing and dependencies and timeline discipline. The work breakdown structure showed us what to do. And now the schedule is going to show us when to do it, and also in what order we do the work. This matters because we can't coordinate work without knowing the sequence that it goes in. And we can't commit to dates without understanding how different things are interrelated, or the dependencies. Without a clear schedule, the work is going to collide, the dependencies will be missed, and we'll make promises that are basically unrealistic. But with a clear schedule, we're going to be able to coordinate everything. We'll be able to see if there are bottlenecks in the work that we're planning, and we'll be able to be realistic about the commitments that we make. Today, we're going to discuss how to sequence the work and keep our timelines together. Just as a reminder, next week, you should bring in component 4, also components 1 through 3. So you should be basically up to that point. That's only going to leave component 5. First, we're going to take a look at a video by Adriana Girdler, where she is going to be talking about 5 musts for sticking to a timeline. And she's going to give us some practical strategies for keeping projects on schedule. And watch for her master milestone approach and how she gets buy-in on timelines, and when to create a detailed schedule versus when something simpler like a calendar will do, and also how we manage dependencies. And then we'll discuss that. A few things that I want you to consider for this component 3, which is your timeline, is what level of detail is going to make sense for your timeline. Should you put every task in there, or should that be in your work breakdown structure, your WBS? And also, as your approach to your project is as an external consultant, how are you going to estimate realistic durations of time for the different elements in your timeline? And finally, what do you think is going to require a detailed breakdown in your timeline versus more of a kind of a top-level overview? You don't necessarily want to have too much detail in your project timeline. That more properly belongs in your work breakdown structure. And when we discussed that in the last module, we talk about that your work breakdown structure needs to be broken down to level 4, which is the tactical level. That's where you actually use action verbs like build, create, research. So that is essential for your work breakdown structure because you're actually describing the work. The timeline, your focus is more on milestones, on deliverables, what needs to be done by when. So that's what you want to think about. Strategically, how do you convey the proper amount of information? So if your Gantt chart is overly complicated, it's going to scare people away. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to create something that's actionable. So you want to be strategic about what goes in your work breakdown structure and what goes in your timeline. And that's actually what I would like you to think about now, which is your approach to creating your timeline and how you're going to structure your timeline in addition to your work breakdown structure, so that you're creating an actionable document. And what makes more sense to have in the work breakdown structure, and what makes more sense to put in your timeline. Take around 5 to 10 minutes and just reflect on how strategically you'll approach, now that we've covered work breakdown structure and timelines, how you'll work with both and what you'll put in your timeline. A Gantt chart is a form, it's a timeline tool, right? What are other timeline tools? A calendar, right? And when might you use a calendar as opposed to a Gantt chart? Another thing that a Gantt chart can do is show dependencies, right? So that if you have one item on your Gantt chart, you can show a line that goes to whatever the dependency is. And then as a tool, as a computer tool, a good project planning software with Gantt charts will keep those dependencies aligned. So if you move an object out, you realize, oh, well, we need more time for this item. It will push the dependency out for you. So you don't have to manually say, oh, well, I didn't notice that when this goes 2 weeks out, that dependency can't start when I thought it would. It'll automatically move it into the right position. So it's more of a dedicated tool, more of a specialized tool. But why do you think, or do you agree that, like you were saying before, that your timeline should have all the work in it that you're planning to do, but do you see why maybe you wouldn't want to have the same level of detail in your timeline? Why might you not want to have every item that's on your work breakdown structure in your timeline? Yeah, so I understand what you're saying, that if you have everything in your timeline, then you'll be sure that nothing gets missed. But you want to think about what's the purpose of your timeline. Remember what she's saying, that your timeline, and she was speaking about a Gantt chart, but a Gantt chart is a form of a timeline. It's not your project management tool. It's not your task management tool. It's a visualization tool. So you want to have enough detail that people can visualize what has to happen, what the major milestones are. But you shouldn't be using your timeline to manage your tasks. You should be using your work breakdown structure for that. Does that make sense? Why you would want to use your timeline as a visualization tool? Because like she's saying, if you have all that detail, one thing that could happen is they have to be so zoomed in that you can't see the whole timeline. You want to be able to see the whole timeline and visually understand the different phases, the major deliverables, the major milestones, and at a glance, see how all the different parts are interconnected. I'm sure that there are variations. Some people have more detail in their timeline, some people have less. But I think the key takeaway is that you want to use your timeline as a visualization tool, and your work breakdown structure is where you actually manage the work and make sure that all the tasks are being done. And in a good work breakdown structure, you could also show percent of completion and things like that. You could assign elements in your work breakdown structure to specific stakeholders and track the completion rates and things like that. So really your work breakdown structure is a good tool for that. So another thing I want you to consider is, for your project, what sort of a timeline will make the most sense? Would it be something as simple as a calendar? or would it be a Gantt chart, or even an Excel spreadsheet like she showed, where you can just have a grid basically with dates across the top for columns. Rows are all the elements, that the major elements of your work breakdown structure, and they just color in specific cells. And that is a Gantt chart, but it's a very basic and simple one. So think about how you might present your timeline for your project plan. I'd like you to reflect on this very question and this very conversation that we had. What will your timeline show and why? So just write on the top of a new page in your journal, write the date, write reflection 2, and below that write what my timeline will show and why. And take about 5 to 10 minutes, and remember, it's just your thoughts. There are no right or wrong answers. What we gained today is clarity on the difference between a timeline and a work breakdown structure. So remember, a work breakdown structure, that's where you show your detailed tasks. That's going to be level 4. And we can think of level 4 as where we use action words: create, build, make. Your timeline is where you show major phases, you show milestones, and deliverables. It's a visual representation of the project. Just like a good map of a subway system, it simplifies the actual paths that the subways take so that you can visually understand what station, where you want to go, which lines get you there. It's not an accurate or detailed representation of the city subways. Another thing is that you might want to create more detail for certain sections of your timeline when that makes sense. And that might be kind of a sub-timeline where you do want to show a little bit more detail, but and this would be kind of like having an inset map where you show more detail. So you see your overall timeline, and then you can show some specific details where that makes sense. You want to be flexible as you consider what is going to work for your project. The project that you're going to be working on, the project that you're writing, has to be actionable. It has to be something that someone could pick up and understand by reading 6, 8, 10 pages. I don't know exactly, but somewhere in that range. Understand exactly what you're undertaking, how you're going to achieve it, and can visualize the timeline and the work that needs to be done. For next week, you want to start thinking about adding the risk management, which is what we're going to be discussing in our next module. And that's where you're going to start identifying what could go wrong and how you would remedy that. In addition, you're going to be having a draft of components 1 through 4. So we'll be talking about risk management and mitigation strategies next, and I will see you after the break.